In this video, we'll explore how to punish the bishop's opening as black. White has plenty of tricky ideas, and I'll show you exactly how to shut them down and take the advantage early. Now, in this position, if black responds with bishop to c5, playing by analogy with the Italian game or simply making a symmetric-looking move, it might seem perfectly fine for black at first glance. However, white can now play pawn to d4. While black can capture either with the bishop or the pawn, in both cases white gains a strong attacking position with good compensation. If black captures with the pawn, which is what most players tend to do, it actually leads to a straightforward loss. Why? Because now bishop takes on f7 becomes a devastating little combination. Followed by queen to h5, it creates a double attack on the black king and bishop. With this simple tactical idea, white manages to expose the black king, and eventually the pawn on d4 will also be picked up by white. As a result, white gains a clearly winning position. This sequence illustrates how tricky the position can be, where just a few natural-looking moves can lead to immediate disaster for black. Now here's another example of a danger in the bishop's opening. Let's say black plays knight to f6. Of course, there are several good ways for white to respond. One effective option is again to play pawn to d4, directly challenging black's control of the center. White's idea here is often to either capture on d4 or push their pawn forward. If black captures on d4, white may even offer the other pawn as a sacrifice and play knight to f3. Now, if black captures the pawn on e4, then after queen takes on d4, the queen attacks the knight on e4. This gives white a lead in development because black is forced to move the knight again, wasting time. With white ahead in development and the e-file potentially open for the rook after castling, this position can become extremely dangerous for black very quickly. If you're not prepared, you could lose the game in just a few moves. This example again shows how difficult it can be to deal with white's aggressive ideas in the bishop's opening. Now let's look at how you should play against the bishop's opening. You may have noticed that white's attacking plans often begin with the move pawn to d4. That's why I recommend you play knight to c6. This move not only develops your knight, but also prevents white from playing pawn to d4 comfortably, so you don't have to worry about or study those sharp and complicated lines. Alright, so after knight to c6, white is now at a crossroads. They can either play knight to f3, which transitions into a classical opening, no longer the bishop's opening, or they can continue with the bishop's opening and try to catch you off guard with tactical tricks. Let's quickly look at both possibilities. If white plays knight to f3, then as mentioned, it's no longer the bishop's opening. The game now transposes into a classical setup where you, as black, have two main options. You can play bishop to c5, heading into the Italian game, or you can go knight to f6, entering the two knights defense. I won't go into a deep analysis of those lines here, as they belong to a completely different opening system. But if you're playing pawn to e5 as black on move 1, you should be familiar with these classical lines. Just as a quick reminder, make sure you know how to handle knight to g5, which leads to the fried liver attack. Now, coming back to our main focus, the bishop's opening, as we just discussed, knight to f3 transitions out of it and leads to more classical positions. So if white wants to stay within the bishop's opening and avoid transposing into classical lines, they would likely play knight to c3. After that, black can also develop naturally with knight to f6. Nothing special so far. Then white continues with pawn to d3. At this point, it might seem like white is just making harmless developing moves, and as black you might think, okay, let me play bishop to c5. This looks like a standard setup. But this is exactly where white may try to trick you. White can now play pawn to f4, and this is when black realizes there was a reason behind white delaying the development of their knight from g1. Since the knight is not on f3, it does not block the f-pawn, allowing white to push it forward and gain extra space. Later, white may even follow up with pawn to f5, launching an aggressive kingside attack. I'm not saying this is automatically winning for white, but it can become very dangerous, especially if you're unprepared. For example, if white now plays knight to f3, they maintain a strong space advantage on the king side, along with multiple attacking ideas. If black, for instance, decides to respond with knight to g4, thinking of jumping in or possibly following up with bishop to f2 check, it can easily backfire without proper preparation. Now, let's say black tries to take advantage of perceived weaknesses. Suddenly, this can turn into a losing position again. White responds with knight to g5, launching a counterattack on the f7 square, using both the bishop and the knight, similar to earlier tactics. But this time, it's even more effective. After black castles to defend the f7 pawn, white pushes pawn to f5, gaining significant space and control on the king side. This move also attacks the knight. The queen joins in the attack as well. Most likely black will try to reposition their knight, often to f2, to avoid the threat. Now comes the crushing blow, queen to h5. This wins the game for white. With overwhelming pressure on the h7 and f7 squares, and full support from white's knight, bishop, and queen, black simply cannot defend. As you can see, the bishop's opening can be extremely powerful. It looks like a calm, classical opening at first glance, but hidden within are numerous sharp tricks and attacking opportunities for white. Now that we've gone over what you should avoid and how dangerous these positions can become, let's finally look at the right way to handle the bishop's opening as black. Understanding white's attacking ideas will clearly show you how to prevent them and play effectively. So after bishop to c4, we respond with knight to c6 to prevent white from easily pushing pawn to d4 early on. White may continue with knight to c3 or pawn to d3. Either way, we play knight to f6. Now, if white plays pawn to d3 and delays developing their kingside knight, that's often a signal they're planning to push pawn to f4. Knowing that, we avoid the typical bishop to c5 development and instead play bishop to b4. Here's the idea. If white now goes ahead with pawn to f4, it backfires. We respond with a strong central counterstrike, pawn to d5, challenging white's center directly, which is a classical chess strategy. When attacked on the flank, counter in the center. If white captures on d5, we recapture with the knight, and now the point of bishop to b4 becomes clear. The knight on c3 is pinned and can't recapture. So we've successfully taken over the center. Even if white captures again on d5, we recapture with the queen, keeping a dominant position. The knight remains pinned, and the queen now also puts pressure on the g2 pawn, giving black a clear advantage. For example, from this position, everything is already going great for black. Now let's step back one move. Since white must deal with the threat to their knight on c3, they often play bishop to d2, which according to the database is the most common response. But it's a poor choice. White's earlier push of pawn to f4, though aggressive, turns into a major weakness. It weakens their kingside defenses, opens key diagonals, and breaks the pawn structure, giving black clear chances to exploit the center and target the exposed king. After white plays bishop to d2, attempting to relieve the pressure on the pinned knight on c3, black has a clear tactical opportunity. By playing knight takes e4, black not only wins a central pawn completely for free, but also creates a direct threat against the g2 pawn. This puts white on the defensive, especially since their kingside is underdeveloped and the king is still in the center. In this position, white doesn't have any good way to regain the lost pawn or counter the growing threats. The earlier f4 push has left long-term weaknesses, and black's active pieces, especially the queen, bishop on b4, and knight on e4, are perfectly placed to increase pressure. With material advantage, better piece coordination, and a safer king, black already holds a clearly winning position both strategically and tactically. For example, if white captures your pawn back, you recapture with your own pawn, and even without deeper calculation, it's obvious the white king is exposed. You have two active bishops, an extra pawn, and strong attacking chances. The queen and bishop can easily join the attack, and you can bring your other bishop to c5 as well. There's simply too much firepower. This is a clearly winning position for black.